Good afternoon. Thanks. We can now see each other a little bit. Sorry, film people. I'm Karen, and this is my team. I am stepping in for Susannah. So what we're going to do is I'll give a brief introduction, and then I'm going to have each panel member give a 2-minute preamble on how they interpreted the theme of innovation. And then we'll structure our conversation around 4 themes that came through conversation and through our declarations yesterday. The word innovation was used in half of the declarations, often generally, and that it was assumed as the world changes, design must change with it, or more importantly, design can provide visions for how it can change. There was overwhelming agreement on big picture challenges. Climate change, massive growth in urban population, but not a lot of consensus on what this means for our discipline or how specifically to go about doing it. But as the original declaration states, we cannot approach this as a one-size-fits-all. What constitutes innovation cannot be determined in general terms. It depends on context. Many declarations pointed this out, the differences in working in various parts of the world. Others spoke today and yesterday on the importance of diversifying the voices in our discipline. And some spoke about innovation specifically in terms of technology. We heard geoengineering, sensing, big data, generally the power of visualization. Obama's strategy for American innovation is primarily about technology funding in all sectors. So technology itself does not create design innovation, but it can foster techniques that open up design possibilities, such as computer simulations, which can offer a relational and time-dependent means for working with a dynamic medium, to using and developing techniques as tools for communication with others, which we also heard about. Data visualization itself, who produces it, who has access to it, and how it is spun is one of the most important aspects of telling a story, one of the most important tools. And as some of the declarations asked, what do we contribute that scientists and engineers don't? Obviously, there are many answers to that question, but part of it is how we can use information in imaginative ways to tell a different story or to make the invisible visible. So the creative combination and synthesis of diverse scales and sources of information enable us to perceive and articulate broader issues of the material, social, and cultural environment. So the composition of our panel, and you can look all of these wonderful people up online, but it suggests that our emphasis is on technology, in particular information and sensor technology, also green tech, which is definitely true to some degree, and you'll hear that in the conversation. But hopefully it will come through as to how these are actually a means for expanding or critiquing standards of practice in some way. So with that, I'm going to ask the panel members to each give a brief response to the theme. We'll start with you.
Well, I'd like to begin by making a confession. I'd actually like to join Martha and Julie's girl band, maybe as a backup singer, because I believe, along with others, that landscape architecture has to be a climate champion. So as a little bit of a provocation or a window into the future, I believe that the 21st century is going to see a quantum shift in the way that landscape systems are valued. As global population heads for 9 billion this century, competition for our remaining virgin environmental resources is going to trigger profound changes to economic theory and practice. And I think that fueled by the proliferation of crises that we're already seeing to emerge, and the sharing of digital media and the access that we have to seeing these things in real time, the prevailing attitudes to the environment are going to continue to shift. And I think they'll shift towards conservation, regeneration, and looking at the environment in new ways. As such, national governments are going to come under increasing pressure from citizens themselves to mandate deep carbon targets and transparently report progress on those targets. So I believe we're going to see a new economy, and under that new economy, the trading of carbon itself, because carbon is the kernel of climate change. We're turning solid and liquid carbon into gaseous carbon. So I think carbon is eventually going to manifest itself as a global market, and it's going to be underpinned by the monetary quantification of ecological and landscape values in this new economy. Effectively a NASDAQ for the environment. There's already around 60 carbon trading programs running at the moment in countries and individual locations, and eventually they're going to come together. And that's going to harness the Internet of Things, big data, real-time management, and that's going to feed back into a feedback loop into that economy. So I think that the outcome of this is that it's going to trigger a flow-on to smarter design practices that optimize life cycle efficiency across energy, water, and carbon systems. We're going to see cities deploying district information management systems that go well beyond BIM. In fact, BIM will be aggregated, infrastructure, public domain, and the idea of smart grids are going to come together. And carbon will be a key part of those grids. Design and creativity will still play a crucial role in these data-enabled project workflows. We still need design thinking to drive the disruption and the innovation. But research and education practice must fall into line. So if landscape architecture wants to play a significant role in an emerging space and emerging economy, we need to change. We need to develop tools that quantify embodied energy, operational carbon, and we need to find the way to display those in our public spaces and environments. So leading up to COP21, which is the next carbon or the next climate conference, I think that landscape architecture has to become a climate champion, and that if we can harness disruption ourselves and start to show how our projects and the things that we do make a contribution to cities and the carbon sequestration of our work, then I think it gives us a lot of leverage and it puts us at the table. So I think there's a possibility through all of that to actually disrupt current metropolitan planning methodologies and also development approval gateways.
Thank you. Great. So we've heard a lot yesterday about the complex global problems addressed in the declarations. We've heard more on that today. And I really think that these complex problems necessitate an innovation in design practice, an expansion of our profession's focus beyond just site design to really reflect our unique capacity for design thinking. Karen mentioned in her introduction that as professionals, we're really uniquely poised to communicate complex problems at a range of scales. And I think the key there is communication. The skills aren't limited to site-based design. And with this in mind, I really believe that a degree in landscape architecture should not limit one exclusively to the practice of landscape architecture as we know it. Landscape architecture itself then really has to innovate and expand in order to better prepare our next generation to spread the beneficial principles of landscape architecture. In a way, we really have a role to evangelize the profession and what we do, our sense for ecology, human-centered design, holistic view of sites, and really to emphasize moving beyond the discipline itself. And in doing that, I think we can encourage students to pursue careers in affiliated fields outside traditional landscape architecture, research, policy, government, journalism, visualization, or as I recently joined, a startup in technology. We heard a number of declarations yesterday that brought up technological challenges as they relate to climate change and engineering. But I think we really need to, as an expanded landscape architecture practice, pay more attention to the range of technological challenges outside ecological planning and engineering so that landscape architects, whether they're inside or outside the profession, can really have a stronger voice on infrastructure, energy, transportation, green space, and something that I'm personally interested in, open data policy. We heard from Christina Hill earlier that yesterday's declarations may not have touched as much on data as they could, and I think that's an important point. We also have to do a better job of fostering individual agency, teaching young landscape architects to be their own advocates, to craft their own agendas, and to find their own voices, thereby training them not to be just good employees, but also proactive entrepreneurs. Finally, in order to better prepare future generations of professionals to play a more integral role in advocacy and policy, we really need to do a better job of reaching and communicating with those outside the profession, as was just mentioned in the society panel. This means simplifying the language that we use, learning to avoid academic jargon, thanks David, and replacing it with the language currently in use to describe the challenges we hope to solve. I think increasing innovation doesn't have to mean increasing complexity. The best way of expanding our ranks and expanding our reach is to keep our communications simple.
Marcel?
I want to talk about landscape architecture, the industry, the $5-ish billion industry, which it's largely consumed with kind of patching and fixing and covering stuff up and making the best of it, designing to the minimums, which we've heard a lot about. And landscape architects, as a result, tend to be reactionary, led by constraints, risk-averse, and part of this personality profile is understandable, economically incentivized, but it's a learned behavior. Professionally, I think it's kind of rare to be commissioned to fail or experiment. And those are just two key functions of invention. In the broadest view of the industry, there's just very little will or skill to incentivize innovation and invent on profound issues that are confronting society. And I think that's a relatively new ambition for the profession. And so this panel sort of premised on the notion that it should be. So I'm interested in innovation as like an intentional result. If you look at other industries and fields, significant shifts in innovation are intentionally stimulated. Agriculture, medicine, aerospace, computer science, funding goes in, investments are made, teams are formed, resources are leveraged, and the conditions for great leaps are made. And eventually, the results are applied to government applications, trials, and then they're adopted by industry and the public sector. So right now, government and industry don't fund landscape architects to invent solutions that are grand challenges facing humanity. And to put this in declaration form, technology-based landscape innovations at all scales and applications just have to accelerate.
So I want to build on Marcel's preamble here about the challenge of experimentation and how do we align ourselves with the kind of technological advancements that are happening all around us in a range of disciplines. I recently had an opportunity to visit Rotterdam, where smart sensor-based dynamic traffic control has been implemented incrementally over the last 12 years. And where new experiments with floating architecture that integrates piezoelectric technology to harness wave tidal energy in anticipation with the imminent sea level rise is being experimented with. I've also visited a number of arid regions where advancements in agriculture and water science have broadened our understanding of cycling of wastewater, of salinated water and aligning them with understanding of plant cultivation and crop production. In my own research, I collaborate with a number of different scientists to test green roof technologies and a number of different landscape-based technologies to look at the environmental performance of different material compositions. How can we achieve better performance? To Christina Hill's a provocation about bridging that performance gap. How do we understand how well are we doing in terms of our green design? And how do we exceed our current performance benchmarks? So I find such technological developments in experimental design to be an enormous potential for our field and in fact essential for the advancement of sustainability. But I will be critical and say that I found very little dialogue on new technology, tools, and methods in yesterday's declaration, and likewise very little technological experimentation in the field at large and also in our academic programs. So where are our think tanks? Where are our technological incubators? What shall we define as disruptive technologies and practices in landscape architecture? We have mobile technologies that have given rise to a huge social transformation in social media, disruptive economic structures such as Uber. Automated mobility is going to change our way that we're thinking about. Leapfrogging technology. The developing world has leapfrogged while they don't have energy infrastructure as we know it. They've leapfrogged to solar. So I urge us to really think about our contribution as an academic and professional field to experimentation, prototyping, and R&D, to interdisciplinary knowledge transfer and education, and to linking academic research within the public and private sectors.
Okay. All right, our fourth theme. So, Liat, I'm going to stay with you on this. Loop is a theme that came up on a number of declarations, and your preambles mentioned the importance of feedback and systems. And this can play out at many points in the design process in many different ways. So you just mentioned a little bit about that kind of feedback and experimentation. How else might this notion, there we go, open up ways of innovating, either in terms of landscape performance or some other criteria?
Well, yesterday, actually, Adrian and I were talking about performance indicators. Patricia O'Donnell talked about the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. There were, Cornelia mentioned the Living Challenge. There's institutes such as the U of T Global Cities Indicator that has actually generated the first ISO standard for cities. The bottom line is that there is an interest, a rising interest in understanding how well are we doing, to understand sustainability as a set of indicators, and to learn from our successes and failures in a systematic way to do better. And so I think that when we're talking about Loop, the idea of responsiveness, the idea of thinking about different time scales of technological understanding of how well we're doing with our green design. And I should also mention that these kind of performance evaluations are not necessarily just quantitative, but they can be, in fact, qualitative. Understanding how well our landscapes are performing on a number of different aspects, whether it's environmental or social. But in this regard, I think that new advancements are happening. These technologies are available. This kind of notion of real-time, continuous data time series acquisition, whether they're via sensors or field technology. The notion is, we talked about simulation and prediction, and those models are oftentimes based on data that either exists or that is imported from different climate regions. The notion of climate specificity, understanding local conditions, understanding changing conditions, and understanding performance over a long time. So there's new developments in thinking about real-time actuation of responses. How do we think about dealing with flood management or fire prevention and extreme climate events, and how do you integrate these kinds of actuation into a real-time response of landscape? The other dimension to it is long-term thinking. How do you archive over time performance and analyze it and understand it in the long term, how well we are performing, feedback that data to designers, to operators, to legislators, to industry standards and user occupants, and understand how we're doing in terms of performance. And what that means is that there's a kind of, there is both a quantitative and qualitative comparison and evaluation of the design intent, or what's called pre-occupancy and post-occupancy actual performance. How do we bridge that gap? And that may have influence on our workflow. What does that mean if the workflow doesn't end when the project is constructed, but rather that this kind of feedback loop is the lifetime of the project that changes the role of the designer within the entirety of the lifetime of the project?
Actually, can I jump in there at that? Because this kind of comes to what Adrian was talking about, and I want to ask, I'm going to move just to this one, and you can continue this because it's related. Defining value in monetary terms for short-term profit has led to our current state of affairs in terms of environmental degradation. And so what you're talking about, and scientists and environmentalists, is to use that same language of economy, of quantifying value, but looking at it over much larger time frames, and quantifying things that haven't previously been quantified. Ecosystem services came up earlier. Now, some of yesterday's declaration warned of this efficiency mindset, or performance-driven obsessions. Others said we have no time to waste. We must use every technology available. And so, Adrian, you made a provocative statement in your opener about landscape architects must harness carbon accounting to disrupt current planning methodologies. Can you expound on how we might do this and what potential innovations, either in terms of how we practice or types of projects, and if designers also might push back the other way, meaning are there ways to push back on how that carbon accounting, or is there reason to push back on how that carbon is accounted for in the first place?
Yeah, I think I heard David Suzuki speak, and it left a deep impression on me. He spoke about this concept of externalities in the economic model that is, and economic theory is, some consider it to be a science, but it's actually not a science. It's just a way of looking at numbers. So what he explained was that the inputs and the outputs of the metabolisms of cities, for example, are not factored into economic thinking. So they're called externalities. So unfortunately, the externalities are the natural resources, the forests, the carbon, the water, the clean resources that the Earth has given us, and the waste, which is the pollution, and the carbon that we send back in the atmosphere. Those two things are not factored in. That means we have a failed economic model that we're all working on. And that drives everything in our society. So until that changes, to drive massive global disruption across how we think, how we consume, that means that we've got to change that model. Now, that's why I see unbelievable opportunity in carbon for us as a profession. Because if we can harness this, and we can actually start to put the data around, the kind of, the way that this giant machine, trees are machines, they produce oxygen, they take carbon dioxide, they lock it up. If we can start to quantify and demonstrate how, through data, how these things operate, then it can be factored in. So the trading of carbon, there's no doubt it is going to be the defining economic shift in this century. It has to be. And it also has to be a gateway to project approval, I believe. We've got to get to a point where, the data around a project, the preemptive, predictive modeling that's done at the design side actually gives you a gateway for approval. So if the project is too consumptive, it doesn't move through the gate. It doesn't get approval. Now, a lot of projects in the cities, and I think cities, again, they can be champions of the environment, because if we can make our cities more intelligent and take the pressure off our natural resources, that's going to help. But the way that cities do that, I think using carbon as a basis for that model, and for us to harness it and demonstrate at the project level, and then push it through, I think we can start building those systems now.
Do you think everything can, in that way, what we heard earlier about things that can't be so easily quantified, intrinsic value, wild aesthetics, do you think these things can work hand in hand, or are they somewhat contradictory in saying you wanted carbon trade is different than a carbon tax. It really is moving in a different direction. And in your opinion, is it carbon trading is the only possible?
Yeah, I think carbon trading is where the market will go, because if you build a project in the city, you can't offset all the carbon. You can't absorb it all. There's only so many plants, so many green roofs, green walls, so many trees you can put on your site. You can't lock up all the carbon that's required in terms of embodied energy and consumption. So that means you need to offset. Now, that offset might come from the Amazonian rainforest or the Colombian coffee plantations. So all of a sudden, they have a quantifiable value, and they're in the chain. So those things are locked up, and not only do they have their agricultural value, their scenic value, or those other intrinsic values, they actually have economic value, because that can be traded and offset against what a project needs to be delivered. So I think that's, the loop.
Would you back this by saying that innovation follows incentive from like very small to the very large?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that markets and economies move towards places of, you know, where money's going to be made. So we're seeing the disruption, you know, whether it be Tesla with batteries, whether it be cars, whether it be, you know, digital platforms. They move to fill gaps, and now it's disruption. So I think it's a natural, again, it's a natural process. It's like an ecological process or an environmental process. It's just kind of the laws of nature that things move in those directions.
I think what's interesting about this kind of, you know, this does lead to a disruptive model also in planning, right? Because what that means is that all of a sudden you are linking spatial planning with, let's say, residual heat, right? So what do we do with residual heat from, you know, from all of our various manufacturing or different aspects of needing to differentiate between heating and cooling? How do we link actual spatial planning under those terms of reference? Or does that lead to a merging of capital budget and operation budget into one, such that you can look at investment of long-term solutions that then feed back the kind of savings in the long term? So it does lead to kind of new structures which eventually affect how we as designers participate in projects.
Okay. So we'll move, sorry, trying to move this along a bit, but this theme is in many ways at the core of the original declaration, which to have more impact, we must increase our numbers. And in some ways, it is still a numbers problem. We're outnumbered by architects 8-to-1, civil engineers 15-to-1, lawyers 30-to-1. But others suggest that it's actually our limited engagement with those outside of our own field, and we really need to look for broader constituencies. So Andy, you'd said that we must do more in terms of entrepreneurship and outreach. And can you give an example of what that might look like, either in education or a particular project, and how technology can actually push innovation in that way?
Yeah, I really do think that it's a two-part answer, and that it really is equal parts increasing our own numbers, but really I think we can view it as increasing our alliances as being as or more important. I think we really have to move away from what we know as the business practice, the client-consultant model, and think about what other ways of staking a claim while receiving financial benefit. One example of the alliance increasing, I think, really has to do with some of the other types of problems and technological challenges that we might look to solve. Infrastructure, I think, is an especially important one. I've worked with the City of Atlanta for the last 2 years, first as a Code for America fellow and now in my role at STAY. Atlanta is currently in the midst of, they've just passed a $250 million infrastructure bond called Renew Atlanta. Our work at Code for America was primarily geared to help that law pass, so there were elements of advocacy and policy involved, but really to try to get the information about the project to community members and allow them to have a voice in the matter. So they were actually able to vote with our platform on what types of green infrastructure they most wanted to see. And this was extremely granular data. It was filtered all the way down to the scale of the neighborhood and the zip code. So we weren't carrying out in a traditional community meeting, rather we were able to get concrete information from citizens across the city and be able to modulate that information to ensure equal representation. The second piece of the Atlanta project that we're doing now is, now that the infrastructure bond has actually passed, we're able to take that money, and they are really interested in investing in smart technology. So the first phase of that project is going to be a pilot project to install smart street lights and air quality monitors, and they'll be installed about a mile apart. And so I think that's one way where a traditional landscape architect may not be involved in the project because there's no green space involved. However, there's an enormous amount of data that's being produced, data that we don't have at that granular level right now about air quality in individual districts. And I think we can help cities to understand what to do with that data. I think, Liat, this speaks to your point too. We have to be able to know what questions we want to ask of the data, and then as site designers, how that information can inform our work. So as we learn more and we get more access to extremely instrumental data about air quality and site analysis and carbon trading, then we can continue that feedback loop and expand and continue to input that information into our projects.
So that's one way, is how we as a discipline can reach out. The other one that has come up, and unfortunately we have to move on to this one, is collaboration across other disciplines and whose expertise we can share. And many declarations pointed out the complexity of projects we're working on, and we must obviously collaborate with others. So this could be for anyone, but what have you found to be some of the opportunities or obstacles for collaboration? And that could be across any sphere, practice to academy, academy to industry. Any examples of how it was overcome in a particular project?
I think this is a matter of perception. Our landscape architects perceived to be able to lead complex endeavors. And I know there's a lot of successes, but I think there's a lot of failures. A particular topical interest is this current Rebuild by Design competition, where the intellectual capital, the inventions of designers, of landscape architects, really the creative thrust, have those projects stayed under the leadership of those designers, right? And I think, no, for the in a lot of cases, no. AECOM is vertically integrated, and that's a good thing that they're leading some of those projects. Kate has a kind of a low-tech and a very smart way of hacking that perception. But no, and they need to be. And so that's a big problem. That's a big problem. That we've got this world of billions that we need to mediate, and you've got an army of 15,000, and they're not perceived to be capable of leading complex endeavors.
Well, I mean, from my perspective, I think that, I see us taking a more active role in academic research, in a multidisciplinary research and a multi-sectoral research. So, for instance, over the last 6 years, I've built a lab, a physical lab on our faculty, which looks at green building technologies. It combines the fields of civil engineering, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, hydrology, ecology, policy. We work with the City of Toronto on a number of different legislation that they have, and the kind of construction standards that they have set forth but never actually tested in the climate and in the ecological context of Toronto, and with the industries who are involved. And there are a lot of myths out there, and we communicate to practitioners, we understand what are the practical aspects of construction, of the kind of performance and infrastructure that is particular to our region, and we try to understand what are the kind of tweaks to these systems that should happen in order to achieve better performance, exceed the kind of performance benchmarks, and mystify or myth some of the misconceptions that are out there in terms of practice. So I think that these kinds of models are encouraging, that they could happen. We can have a very strong role in actually bringing these disciplines together that are oftentimes working in isolation, and engaging a general public in understanding the value, engaging with policymakers and legislation and how those get written up, and the influence on what gets, how industry is then manufacturing different materials and technologies out there.
I have to move on to questions, but just to go back to, and maybe this will come up in the questions, but what Marcel was saying about we know to ask scientists and anthropologists and engineers to the table, do they know to invite design, and and not for you to answer this, but we've had this in our conversation, is what are the mechanisms by which they would understand that that's integral, because that is one way. So some engineering schools are looking at integrated modeling courses where you have like scientists, anthropologists, engineers, and because more and more of the money, which money's come up in our panel a lot, from NSF, for example, require these interdisciplinary teams. And so they're trying to come up with a kind of shared way of approaching that so that they're all kind of in on those grants, because NSF recognizes you need all of that different expertise. Okay, so we get to pick. So I think, I don't, does anyone want to take on this first one about innovation? It's a very, very generic term. So we just chose to talk about it in particular in terms of sensing information technologies. I think number 2 is something we should talk about.
I saw the term recently, failing forward, and I think, Marcel, this brings up what you were talking about in your preamble about a greater need for innovation, and I think innovation is perhaps a highly positivist term that still doesn't recognize the benefits of failure, as long as we are failing forward and learning from the mistakes that we're making and doing that in a safe environment. I would say we need to not be afraid of the term failure, but we need to be able to learn from it, and we need to be able to use it when we speak about our work.
Any other thoughts on the client? Who's the client? In whose interest is all of our data being organized? In whose interest I think that the client has not been, Marcel, you have private practice, you have private practice. Are there product needs to be marketable? How does this theme play into the private practice as opposed to academic research?
I just have an observation on this, and that's that a lot of landscape architects just need to ultimately know a client's not going to say take our resources and gamble them. And I think you hear a lot of people talk about their projects and the innovations that they've made within them and leaps that they've made within them. And a lot of times it's just because they went and did it. They didn't ask for permission. They just went and did it. And you have to find that and take the risk and do it and be successful. I think that successes are the only are going to be the best evidence that we're capable.
I think also on the client side, I mean, clients come to us because they want intelligent thinking. They want, they want the advice. So when it comes to the kind of life cycle assessment that we're talking about in terms of data and the performance of a project over time, if you can make a project perform better, you're saving that client money. So it's efficiency and optimization. Actually, at the end of the day, if you own and operate a property and you're the client, well, there's a direct bottom line, saving for the life of that project. So I think a client is still front and center of, in terms of private practice. But I think what needs to happen is that, at a federal level, there needs to be the mechanisms that are in place, the policies in place that, if we're going to have, for example, deep carbon cuts, they have to be mandated globally and they need to be orchestrated at a national level, and then they flow through into the local level, and then that means us giving advice to our clients about how to navigate project approvals, optimize projects, and still provide our design intelligence to make their projects more robust.
If I could just interject for 1 second, I think what I'd like to also, I think there's maybe a kind of an assumption that as academics we have no role in terms of thinking about client, but I think that universities, for instance, are the single largest landowner in cities oftentimes, and they have a large impact on what is happening in terms of their overall sustainability mission and carbon emissions and embedded energy and campus planning, thinking about that. And we have, I think that thinking about universities as test beds for pilot projects, for the kind of decarbonization that could happen on a city level, could happen here. And as academics, these are our immediate clients, because we can deal with research that delivers directly to building operators, to campus planners, and to all those who are making decisions on a huge piece of the city region.
say we can even take that a step farther, and if the university is a kind of incubator or accelerator, we can really, I think, start to look to the private sector, technology in particular, and think about the ways that an incubator or accelerator or venture capital model might free us from the constraints of a client consultant model altogether. So right now, if we're 80–90% dependent on client funding for services rendered, then that's not allowing any space or time or funding in particular for ideas to be generated and incubated. So I think if we can start to think about what clients look like when they're not a client, when they might be soliciting funding from venture capital or working on an idea without a client, there's not enough time or space for that in the current practice model. And so we really need to perhaps think of alternate words for client as well.
I think a lot of interesting things are going on in a lot of universities. I think but they're small. The projects are small, and it's because they don't have enough zeros and behind them. And I think the LAF and the ASLA should be interested in adding zeros to those projects. If we, I think, if you look back, if we look back on this time, I think it's kind of like, to use a kind of tired Silicon Valley reference, it's the kind of Jobs and Wozniak in the garage moment for landscape architects and enormous potential. And you just have to create the visibility and add the funding to really make that flourish.
Yeah. I think this question up here, the first one, is incredibly important. We haven't really had a chance to talk about it. It's important to remember that McGregor and his crew weren't just, passionate about their work. They developed the methods by which that became how to work with data information, what became GIS. It's data management. It's become so absorbed into practice we forget it's just a convention now, but it was really revolutionary and it changed practice. So I think that GIS is certainly still relevant. It's good for certain things, not good for others, but the development of new tools and techniques is part of how you innovate the field. What tools allow you to work with how we might understand hydrodynamics rather than just a layer system, so you're understanding things over time. And so I think, and even Andy in your work in terms of how you work with digital media and data, it's absolutely essential that we're investing in the design process side of things in terms of innovation, because that changes how we visualize and understand our landscapes.
Yeah, I'd say just to add to that, I think it's a question of resolution. So, depending on what scale of are you looking at the mesoscale of a kilometer square, which maybe GIS is more appropriate for, or are you looking at a granular, like micro nanoscale where you might employ sensor data and different kind of software and evaluation, or are you looking at, infrared imaging? And to understand urban heat island effect and what surfaces would be more beneficial, or how you can actually argue for carbon accounting of landscapes because they're better performing with respect to evapotranspiration and cooling. So all these, there's lots of, in terms of computation, in terms of analysis and software, I think it has to do with the granularity, the scale of what you're looking at, and how you may actually, interface different data sets together.
As a project example, we're working with the state government in New South Wales, which is Sydney is a city inside there, and we're working on a green and blue grid, which is using GIS as the base data. And effectively what it's doing is looking across the entire city and mapping all of the open space assets and the waterway assets. And then it's looking to log the data on those. So tree canopy, carbon is actually going to be factored into that calculation across the entire green network on the city. And then it's looking for logging that data and doing the mapping to look for the connections and the new insertions and the kind of amplification of that network. So GIS is underpinning that, but then what we're looking at is a set of algorithms that sit underneath that. So in terms of density gradient for the center of the city to the kind of suburb and the gradients in between. When you do new projects, what kind of public facilities and open space models and typologies should be incorporated in those? You know, because in the city it could be a skate rink, it could be a pool, a basketball court. You can't provide a sports field. So in terms of density gradient, what is the appropriate sort of public open space that's provided across those densities? And GIS provides all of the data that sits behind that allows that modelling to take place. So I think it's a very powerful sort of iteration of what McGregor built, and I think it's really, really useful.
Okay, we're out of time for our conversation, but we have a few provisional takeaways based on what was said yesterday. The first one is about a lot of other disciplines, architecture, for example, have post-professional degrees with specific concentrations, and since there was a lot of discussion about needing more specialization in certain areas without that meaning becoming scientists, it's just how do you take the MLA, which is a very lateral way of thinking and has been very successful, but add some concentration. So we think that schools should consider how they might do this within their own institutions. What institutional structures might be hindering curriculum development, and think about transdisciplinary methods for research. Again, this is going to be specific to individual schools, but something each could consider. And lastly, or second to last, collaborate to invest in a database of grant and funding opportunities. So much of the conversation yesterday and today has been, where is the money, or how do we find the money? And you're talking about bake sales and small, small $15 or $50 or even $500,000 grants. A lot of it is just this is a full-time job, just finding money, and so how to make that easier and more accessible. Lastly, at lunch, please email the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is what they say that we do. Thank you.